Well, my good friends, we have a few disturbing trends, but starting with a chilling study shows how hostile college students are towards free speech. Catherine Rampell with the Washington Post reports, here's the problem with suggesting that upsetting speech warrants safe spaces or otherwise conflating mere words with physical assault. If speech is violence, then violence becomes a justifiable response to speech, which is dangerous, as is obvious. Just ask college students. A fifth of undergrads now say it's acceptable to use physical force to silence a speaker who makes offensive and hurtful statements. That's one finding from a disturbing new study of students conducted by John Villazner, a Brookings Institute senior fellow at University of California at Los Angeles professor. In August, motivated by concerns about the narrowing window of permissible topics for discussion on campuses, Villazner conducted a nationwide survey of 1,500 undergraduate students at four-year colleges. Many of Villazner's questions were designed to gauge students' understanding of the First Amendment. Colleges, after all, pay a lot of lip service to freedom of speech, despite high-profile examples of civil liberty squelching on campus. The survey suggests that this might not be due to hypocrisy so much as misunderstanding of what the First Amendment actually entails. For example, when students were asked whether the First Amendment protects hate speech, 4 in 10 said no. This is, of course, incorrect. Speech promoting hatred, or at least speech perceived as promoting hatred, may be abhorrent, but it is nonetheless constitutionally protected. And here's their little graph. Women are more likely than men to believe that hate speech is not constitutionally protected. And here's the breakdown between Democrats and Republicans. There were no statistically significant differences in response to this question based on political affiliation, but there were significant differences by gender. Women are more likely than men to believe hate speech is not constitutionally protected. Then it goes on. Most chilling findings, however, involved how students think repugnant speech should be dealt with. Villazner offered a hypothetical that may sound familiar to those who recall recent fracases at California State University, Los Angeles, Middlebury College, Claremont McKenna College, and other institutions. Let's say a public university hosts a very controversial speaker, one known for making offensive and hurtful statements. Would it be acceptable for a student group to disrupt the speech by loudly and repeatedly shouting so that the audience cannot hear the speaker? And they show the survey results. Astonishingly, half said that snuffing out upsetting speech rather than presumably rebutting or even ignoring it would be appropriate. Democrats were more likely than Republicans to find this response acceptable, 62 versus 39%, and men were more likely than women, 57 versus 47%. Even so, sizable shares of all groups agreed. It gets even worse. Respondents were also asked if it would be acceptable for a student group to use violence to prevent the same controversial speaker from talking. Here, 19% said yes. 1 in 5 respondents say using violence to disrupt a controversial speaker is acceptable. And here's their chart. And it seems to be politically equal, 20 versus 22%, Democrat, Republican, Independents. What the big difference is, female 10%, but male 30%. Men, however, were 3 times as likely as women to endorse using physical force to silence controversial views, 30% of men versus 10% of women. None of this bodes well for the alt-right's Berkeley Free Speech Week events next week. Judging from the lineup, which includes professional troll Milo Yiannopoulos and Pizzagate conspiracy theorist Mike Cernovich, the apparent goal of this event is not to help students face hard truths or grapple with thoughtful conservative viewpoint. It's to say disgusting things in an attempt to provoke liberals into doing something stupid, surrendering any claim to moral high ground. If that happens, President Trump's both sides comment will ring a little truer, while liberals and colleges are further cemented as whataboutists, bogeymen for the right. In truth, lefties can do more to call out threats to civil liberties perpetuated by their ideological allies, and colleges can do more to promote freer debate. But many of Villazner's results, like those from other data sources, show that the right is also astonishingly open to shutting down speech. What's more, colleges alone are not to blame for these findings. Other data suggests that freshmen are arriving on campus with more intolerant attitude towards free speech than their predecessors did, and that American Americans of all ages have become strikingly hostile towards basic civil and political liberties. Colleges provide a crucible for America's increasingly strange attitude towards free discourse, but they are just the canaries in a coal mine. And I agree. It's a disturbing trend.
Lisa Feldman-Barrett is a psychology professor at Northeastern University. In a recent piece for the New York Times entitled "When is Speech Violence?" she argues in defense of banning speeches by figures like Milo Yiannopoulos, calling him a provocateur and hate monger and saying there is, quote, nothing to be gained from debating him. But she doesn't stop there. She says her anti-speech posture is based in science, and that scientifically speaking, some speech literally is as harmful as physical violence.
What I'm saying is, if you're going to make decisions about who to invite, pick the people who will, engage in debate, and avoid the people who won't. And there's an extra reason for doing that now, because But
you're not, I still am confused by what you're saying. I mean, how do we know? The average person, who is you haven't thought through your argument. It seems to me what you're saying, with respect, is there are some views that I don't like. They're not real views. I don't have to take them seriously because I don't feel like engaging with them. So just shut up. Because I'm asking you to define your terms and you don't seem like you can.
I did define my terms.
Okay, so what is the average
person? It's a legal concept.
But which means what? You don't seem to understand what it means. How do you define it?
Are you telling me that you can't tell the difference between censorship and the difference between who to invite? Are you telling me? Are you telling me that?
I'm trying to get you to define a term that you introduced into the conversation. Reasonable person, average person. I'm asking you a simple question. What does that mean? You can't answer it. You're changing the subject, and I'm just saying you're the one who wrote the New York Times op-ed, but you didn't bother to think this through with any precision.
I'm actually not changing. I'm not changing the subject.
And we are going to switch over to The Economist, where they are talking about free speech on campus, and somewhere down, and the links to all these articles will be in the description below, but further down in the article, many students have said privately that the campus has become a place where they are afraid to express dissenting opinions. Students who disagree with the protesters' views on social media have been denounced as racist by activist leaders. A newly accepted international student was mocked when she asked her future classmates if there were any libertarian groups on campus. White students have complained that they have been told by other students that they are unjustified in speaking about race and identity in class. When one student voiced a dissenting opinion on social media, his classmate threatened to get him fired from his job at the college bookstore. It's an environment with limited representation of opinion, and it can be hostile to students who hold other views, says Yuta Kato, a sophomore.
The multicultural educator at Stanford University liked to go around saying, I started looking for racism everywhere, and I started finding racism everywhere. And indeed, he did. If you start looking for anything everywhere, you will start finding it everywhere. I do think things have gone way too far in the other direction today, where we have this sort of scorched earth strategy being waged against our own society. And I think we have to find some sort of balance between the two. Now, it's always difficult to know exactly where you draw the balance, but I'd suggest to you one indicator, and I think one very important salient feature is, of course, that this whole multicultural debate over looking at racism, sexism, other forms of oppression is something that could only take place within the context of Western civilization, within the context of the civilization where individual rights, individual human rights became possible. And multiculturalists go too far when they forget that the very rhetoric that animates their debate is the rhetoric of the West. And they always forget this. They always forget it. So I do think they go too far, at least in that one extremely salient regard. It's about speech codes. This is sort of the bigger problem, is that on a lot of these college campuses we have speech codes where people feel they cannot debate topics and so on. And it is true that these speech codes are often not very rigorously enforced. They're not very precise. They are, in fact, it's often very unclear what you can say and what you cannot say. But I will suggest to you they have a tremendous stifling effect nonetheless, because the way these speech codes work in practice is that you, as a student, will err on the side of silence. They are incredibly inhibiting of controversial discourse. And that's why a lot of people are saying enough is enough. In putting together the diversity myth, one of the interesting things my co-author and I found was that we got some of the most enthusiastic support from people who would be considered on the liberal or moderate end of the political spectrum. They're often the ones who are in academia. They're the traditional academics who tend to be politically quite liberal, but who don't necessarily want to follow this hard left party line. And they have simply had it. And that's why there is this debate about political correctness, and that's why we're going to have to do something about the problem. Thank you.
History could pivot in the direction of the values that you are standing here for.
Yeah, resign.
What?
Resign.
I'm a deeply progressive person, and
Oh, okay.
I must say I'm.
There you go.
I'm
I'm troubled by what this implies about the current state of the left.
Well, you think? You said people shouldn't be allowed to speak or not on the basis of their skin color, which seems like a foundational belief of the left, and one that I agree with strongly. And for that, they physically threatened you and are trying to get you fired. This is unbelievable.
Yes, they are absolutely trying to get me fired, and they believe that my words in my email are transparently racist, and I think we're caught quite off guard when people who were not at Evergreen read my letter and couldn't find any racism in it.
On the age of shitlords, they're talking about Social Justice Warriors form organization to argue online on behalf of minorities. And it's the White Nonsense Roundup. Have you ever been so bored that you launched a volunteer organization with the sole purpose of debating trolls or on behalf of people of color? Layla Trumbull and Terry Compton, the two women you see in the picture on top of this article, started an organization called White Nonsense Roundup, which they say exists to argue with other white people so that people of color don't have to. Well, mighty white of you. If you're a person of color having an argument on the internet with a white person, just tag the White Nonsense Roundup page and they will send over a representative to argue on your behalf. They say, if you are a person of color, you have enough on your plate. It's not your job to educate white people about privilege, racism, and what's really going on in the world. If a white person is filling your social media with white nonsense, ooh, that's terrible. Anything from overt racism to well-intentioned problematic statements, tag us and a white person will come round up our own. Well, taking out the trash, I guess. I feel inclined to state explicitly that this organization is not satire and these people are 100% serious. A pinned post on the top of the group's Facebook page has gone viral on Facebook, and thanks to an article from the Huffington Post praising the group's efforts, the page now has close to 100,000 Facebook followers. Well, I'm going to have to check that page out. The owner of the group told the Huffington Post that it's the responsibility of us white folks to do the emotional labor that's required to educate other white folks, and it shouldn't be required of people of color again and again. In short, people of color shouldn't have to defend their arguments online like everybody else. Yes, obviously, the only adults in the room are white people, the ones being racist and making problematic statements, and the other adults who are going to be the adults for the black people who cannot speak for themselves, and these are the self-appointed white patrol, the white knights, or whatever they call themselves. Instead, white people should just accept everything minorities say as fact, whether it is an argument about race, politics, science, or baseball. In an event that a white person doesn't agree with a person of color, then other white people should step in to convince him to. How about that? If a person of color says anything at all, like the world's going to end tomorrow, well, it's just fact. Okay, take the exchange below for an example. A white person, Daniel, is debating a black person, Lisa, about whether all white people are born racist or not. The black person doesn't have a valid argument, so she tags White Nonsense Roundup to argue on his behalf. Daniel said, Lisa Costin, I'm automatically racist because I was born white. Isn't that like saying you're automatically good at math because you were born Asian? Didn't MLK say not to judge based on color of skin, but rather content of character? And then he also says, look at this stupid shit. White Nonsense Roundup says, it isn't racist to question. It perpetuates racism to not examine your bias and to think that we know better than anyone else what is needed to end racism. White Nonsense Roundup also says no one is saying white people are born racist. Systematic racism exists, and we grow up in a culture that centers whiteness and favors whiteness. That isn't about us as individuals, but about the system that we exist within, and it is up to us to examine our role in that system and commit to not perpetuating it. What a bunch of trash. If we aren't fighting to dismantle systems of oppression, then we are complicit in them. That doesn't mean you need to feel bad for being white, although I'm sure that's your intention. It is just about needing to be aware of what it can mean in our current system. Well, I guess she told Daniel. The group claims to have nearly 60 volunteer workers across the United States and a few in Canada who ran 4-hour shifts to monitor social media for tags of their page so they can respond in a timely manner. They even have a vetting process and receive debate training. Whenever you see the phrase first world problems online, this is what they're referring to. These people's lives lives are so devoid of troubles that they can find the time to argue other people's points for them on the internet. It seems like the social justice movement is getting more and more retarded every day that goes by. As for me, I'm not sure how many more of these articles I can write before I decide to kill myself and end it all. Well, I recommend drinking some bleach.
I think that we have a lesson to learn from intersectionalism, and that is that when we're talking about racism, white people should be quiet.
My job is to listen and be a voice, and my job is to shut other white people down when they want to interrupt.
We talked about trolls in this article. Age of Shitlords has another article about a famous troll, Milo Yiannopoulos, and the article is Diabetes Cat Posters at UC Berkeley Trigger Fat Feminist and Antifa. This article was first published for Squawker Media by author Jack Kenrick. Things continue to heat up on the UC Berkeley campus as we head into next week's Free Speech Week event. While the campus just last week managed to survive hosting the only slightly less controversial conservative personality, Ben Shapiro, thanks mainly to the effective police work and arrests made by local police forces. It is not likely the same will be said for next week's events, especially considering the violent riots that occurred the last time Milo came to town. When you throw in the fact that this time he will be bringing equally controversial figures with him such as Ann Coulter and Steve Bannon, we have a recipe for a political clash not seen since Charlottesville. That said, the war of ideas is already raging on the campus ahead of the actual event, with Milo and allies working their usual brand of sarcastic, politically incorrect magic. Their latest tactic, striking back against the wave of anti-free speech week signs that had been growing around campus by placing some of their own. Plastered right on top of signs reading "Shut down Milo Yiannopoulos," the meme-filled counter-protest sign states, "Feminists, please stop being fat and let Milo speak." The original anti-Milo signs also carry the words, "No platform for white supremacists at UC Berkeley," as if Milo, whose entire platform is based around rejection of identity politics of all kinds, was a white supremacist somehow. Proving once again these SJW types so rarely take the time to learn anything about people they claim to be triggered by. And here's a quick video of Diabetes Cat Milo has on his website. As the country grows increasingly more polarized year by year, we're going to have to learn how to have discussions with each other, left and right, have mature discussions with each other, without the violence, without the threats of violence, and without all the hysterics on both sides. That is, speech is violence, and therefore violence is justified against speech. This is a disturbing trend that needs to end. And how could we end a video without mentioning the news that has just come out on the Wall Street Journal about Inside the Madness at Evergreen State? The school denies it is a racially hostile work environment, but internal emails belie that assertion. By Jillian K. Melchior. Biology professor Brett Weinstein has settled his lawsuit against Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Mr. Weinstein became a pariah last spring when he criticized an officially sanctioned day of absence, during which white people were asked to stay away from campus. He and his wife, anthropology professor Heather Haying, alleged that Evergreen has permitted, cultivated, and perpetuated a racially hostile and retaliatory work environment. They claimed administrators failed to protect them from repeated, provocative, and corrosive verbal and written hostility based on race, as well as threats of physical violence. Last week, the university announced it would pay $500,000 to settle the couple's complaint. Evergreen said in a statement that the college wrongly rejects the lawsuit's allegation, denies the day of absence was discriminatory, and asserts the college took reasonable and appropriate steps to engage with protesters, de-escalate conflict, and keep the campus safe. A different story emerges from hundreds of pages of Evergreen correspondence, which I obtained through Washington State's Public Records Act. The emails show that some students and faculty were quick to levy accusations of racism with neither evidence nor consideration of the reputational harm they could cause. Well, we're not surprised by that, are we? The emails also reveal Mr. Weinstein and Miss Haying were not the only ones concerned about a hostile and dangerous campus. Consider a February exchange in which Mr. Weinstein, a progressive who is skeptical of identity politics, faulted what he called Evergreen administrators' reckless top-down reorganization around new structures and principles. Within minutes, a student named Mike Penhaligon fired back an email denouncing Mr. Weinstein and his racist colleagues. Another student, Steve Kaufman, responded by asking for proof of racism within the science faculty. Mr. Kaufman cited Christopher Hitchens' variation of Occam's razor. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. Jacqueline McClenny, an office assistant for the First People's Multicultural Advising Services, a campus office that helped organize the Day of Absence, observed that because Hitchens' razor is an Englishman's popularization of a Latin proverb, it would seem to itself be the product of at least two traditionally hierarchical imperialist societies with an interest in disposing of inconvenient questions. Well, that's a mouthful. Media professor Naima Lowe urged one of Mr. Weinstein's defenders to read about how calls for civility are often used to silence and or dismiss concerns about racism. She also said that the white people making changes in their white supremacist attitudes and behaviors were those who do not immediately balk and become defensive, instead acknowledging that white supremacy is literally ingrained in everything. In other words, merely defending oneself against the accusations of white supremacy is evidence of guilt. Reminds me of, you are guilty until proven innocent in totalitarian states. The implications of such a mindset became clear later last spring when hundreds of students protested Mr. Weinstein's opposition to the Day of Absence. To them, the existence of dissent was sufficient to prove the college condoned racism. Mr. Weinstein was not their only target. After a mob occupied the library, the college's facilities engineer, Richard Davis, wrote in an email that he believed the students are testing how much lawlessness will be tolerated, and they have not found a boundary yet. He described how two students stalked him and screamed at him, adding that he was disturbed by the lack of police. Many of us are stating that as long as the students are not violent, their behavior is acceptable. Mr. Davis continued, apparently violence in this context is bloodshed. The protests were loud and at times intimidating, wrote John Hurley, Evergreen's vice president for finance and administration. Unfortunately, some members of our community were stopped as they tried to leave campus, and that was scary, and others felt barricaded in their office. Nancy Koppelman, an American Studies and Humanities professor, described being followed by white students who yelled and cursed at me, accused me of not caring about black and brown bodies, and claimed that if I did care, I would follow their orders. Mrs. Koppelman, who is 5'1", and the students towered over her, and the only thing they would accept was my obedience. She reported that the encounter so unnerved her that she was left physically shaking. Mrs. Koppelman wrote that she was worried about features of the current protest strategy that violate the social contract and possibly the law. Tolerating such tactics, she argued, may create a working environment which is too hostile for some of us to continue our employment at the college. Her email concluded, I have not decided whether or how to share these thoughts more widely. If I do, I will very likely be tagged as a racist by some of my colleagues and the students they teach. As for Mr. Weinstein and Ms. Haying, there's no doubt the environment at Evergreen was too hostile for them to continue their employment. The college declared in its statement, they have agreed to resign from their faculty positions at Evergreen effective today. What we have is a disturbing trend of violence or intimidation or both on campus, which is hurting the educational environment, which is hurting the ability to hear other thoughts, hear opposing opinions, listen to others, and be a part of a community. There's little doubt that our dear friends on the political and cultural left are sincere in their beliefs, like some characters in the ancient Greek tragedies, which often dealt with moral right and wrongs. Today's figures on the extreme regressive left suffer from hubris and arrogance in their certainty of the issues. These dramas were known as tragedies for a reason, and our modern-day social justice warriors would do well to heed the advice of tragic stories from the past. There is little virtue in considering yourselves without fault while consistently pointing a finger at others who do not share in your belief system. Have some faith in the nature of humanity and listen to what others have to say on important issues. Some old philosopher might have once said, fools give speeches, but wise men chase girls. Goodbye.